Welcome to the first episode of the Persuasion Project's Dharma Talk series. So this is something that I've been wanting to do for a while now, is try to bring the subject of Buddhism, the Dharma, to a wider audience. It seems that the audience of the alternative psychedelic community that I've been a part of, YouTube, please don't strike me, the harm reduction, educational, you know how it goes. A lot of them seem very interested in pursuing alternative spirituality, alternative religious experiences, things that are different from your standard American contemporary, vague Protestant Christianity. So many people, when they're raised in like an American Christian upbringing, find the whole process very fundamentally unsatisfactory, especially those who are looking for more materialist, more specific reasoning behind their beliefs. There just isn't really much there for people to really cling on to. And so I myself kind of had that own struggle, that own difficulty, where I was raised relatively agnostic. My family did not go to church. We did not have any particular religious upbringing. And that was fine until the age of maybe 10 to 12. I don't recall the specific year. But I had kind of like a sort of existential crisis at that age where I had deep concerns with, death, mortality. I found the general Christian narrative to be very underwhelming and in some cases, frankly, ominous. The whole idea of like, once you die, you go to heaven forever. That like idea of eternity, that idea of persisting in a state indefinitely was very distressing to me. And so it kind of just caused this sort of crisis of consciousness that I believe kind of kickstarted my depressive tendencies. During that era, I ended up going into counseling, ended up going towards, trying to find some way to deal with the depressive tendencies, and that too was deeply unsatisfactory, where my experience with counseling was, basically some person who has no real connection to you, no real bond, kind of giving vague suggestions of things that you yourself may recognize are troublesome, you may recognize are difficult, that you need to work towards. But without there being an actual guided plan to actualize those processes, it kind of brings about a stagnation. And so counseling very much did not work for me at that time. And so I continued for a few years kind of in this state of ambiguity, until eventually I started getting very deep into sort of occultism, paganism, alternative religious practices. And I maintained that for a while. I still maintain some of that now. It's a complicated dynamic. But towards the end of that, I became far more interested in the subject of Buddhism. Buddhism, as understood in the West, in the United States, and much of Europe, is very misunderstood, where it's often generalized. It's not given its real, it is a far more complex philosophical religious entity than a lot of people like to think it is. And in many ways, there's a sort of Orientalism about it, where it's even people who are very interested in it or find benefits from it view it from a lens that is, it has marks of colonialism, marks of, Orientalism, where it's taking these items, these ideas in abstract, and pulling them away from the cultural context on the ground. And so that can be a great difficulty when trying to study Buddhism while not living in a country that actively practices it. And so as I began to just kind of learn or pick up on these ideas, more and more of it began to sort of, inspire me that this is a far more cohesive, a far more internally consistent worldview than a lot of other religious or philosophical trends. And part of this process of growing and part of my degree in international diplomacy, I took a series of classes pertaining to East Asian and Asian religious studies. And obviously among that topic was Buddhism, stressed pretty heavily. And so what I decided to be the opener for kind of getting into these subjects is one of the books I was assigned to read for one of these classes. It is called The Heart of the Buddhist Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh. So this book is frankly kind of controversial, especially in like the academic Buddhist circles, because it can sometimes fall into that Buddhist modernism, you know, taking the ideas away from the religious practical context. And on the same side, in many ways, that can be quite appealing to a culture that did not grow up with that. And so Thich Nhat Hanh in specific, he is a Buddhist monk. He practices Mahayana Buddhism, which I imagine we'll be getting into pretty in detail as we proceed. He's from Vietnam, and he's written a lot of books kind of trying to surmise a lot of the practices and teachings of Buddhism in a way that it could be consumed by an audience that lacks that context. So I believe that this book can be a very solid framework to begin the discussion, but it is a point of beginning a discussion. It is a jumping off point. But that being said, I feel like it has value, and I kind of want to get back into seeing, you know, kind of my own personal growth as a Buddhist. One might not expect it, and I certainly would not have expected it. But so back when I first started, you know, actively practicing Buddhism in 2019, I was very much a complete substance abolitionist. You know, I was a sort of like Puritan. I viewed, you know, substance use as a sort of cheat code or a way to bypass it. But as I began to progress, I began to understand that this obsession with sobriety, this obsession with there being one consistent perceived consciousness, is in and of itself a form of attachment and craving that is contrary to that of the Buddhist framework. So by engaging in the transhumanist use of substances, and again, YouTube, this is for education and harm reduction purposes, I believe that I've gained far more insights using that Buddhist framework in specifically a psychedelic context, where I've made leaps and bounds beyond what I would have expected. Things that I dreamed to have perceived academically, I believe that I now perceive experientially through psychedelic enhanced meditation. It's a fascinating one. So with that in mind, we're going to be getting into the book. This first episode is going to be kind of ranty and introductory, as you've seen. We're going to go piece by piece. I'm not sure how frequently I'm going to do this. My time is kind of... it's not as great as it used to be. And I feel like an important part of a Dharma talk, a conventional, you know, Dharma teaching session, is it being extemporaneous. No editing, no going back. The Buddha sat and he spoke in front of many. He didn't have the opportunity to cut content. He didn't have the opportunity to go back. He could clarify, but that ultimately is a means of communication. So expect my tangents to potentially go off. I hope somebody finds some sort of value with this. And so with that, we will begin at the beginning of The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. How I will likely do this is I will read chunks of the book, and then we will discuss it. I intend on doing all of these while live streamed, so there is a chance that some people may stop by and ask questions, but I will be operating under the assumption that nobody's going to be here. For all I know, this could just be an exercise for my own personal growth. You know, being able to actually communicate these thoughts, even if it's to an audience of no one. All right. Part 1, The Four Noble Truths. Chapter 1, Entering the Heart of the Buddha. Buddha was not a god. He was a human being like you and me, and he suffered just as we do. If we go to the Buddha with our hearts open, he will look at us, his eyes filled with compassion, and say, "Because there is suffering in your heart, it is possible for you to enter my heart." The layman, Vimalakadhi, said, "Because the world is sick, I am sick. Because people suffer, I have to suffer." This statement was also made by the Buddha. Please don't think that because you are unhappy, because there is pain in your heart, that you cannot go to the Buddha. It is exactly because there is pain in your heart that communication is possible. Your suffering and my suffering are the basic condition for us to enter the Buddha's heart and for the Buddha to enter our hearts. So I believe this first 2 paragraphs kind of outline some important concepts immediately. The first being, the Buddha is not a god. You do not worship the Buddha per se as you might the Abrahamic god, or even in like a polytheistic context, like the Vedic deities you see in Hinduism. Buddha is a teacher that you look up to, but your goal is ultimately to reach his level. It is something that is attainable. So he is meant more as a guidance piece rather than a person who you bow down and submit to per se. Another key concept that a lot of people may struggle with is the sort of framing around suffering or craving. A lot of this is kind of a sort of translation complication, to where in the original Pali that the Buddha would have spoken, there is nuance to some words that we don't really necessarily see in the English. As that becomes more apparent, I'll try to do my best to clarify. I imagine Thich Nhat Hanh himself will do much to clarify. Proceeding onwards. For 45 years, the Buddha said over and over again, "I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering." When we recognize and acknowledge our own suffering, the Buddha, which means the Buddha in us, will look at it, discover what has brought it about, and prescribe a course of action that can transform it into peace, joy, and liberation. Suffering is the means the Buddha used to liberate himself, and it is also the means by which we can become free. So a key point here is the juxtaposition between suffering and liberation. It kind of goes to that idea that, like, you cannot have light without darkness. You cannot have darkness without light. It is in the juxtaposition that growth can actually be made. Without suffering, there cannot be progress. There is stagnation. The ocean of suffering is immense, but if you turn around, you can see the land. The seed of suffering in you may be strong, but don't wait until you have no more suffering before allowing yourself to be happy. When one tree in the garden is sick, you have to care for it. But don't overlook all the healthy trees. Even while you have pain in your heart, you can enjoy the many wonders of life. The beautiful sunset, the smile of a child, the many flowers and trees. To suffer is not enough. Please don't be imprisoned by your suffering. If you experience hunger, you know that having food is a miracle. If you have suffered from the cold, you know the preciousness of warmth. When you have suffered, you know how to appreciate the elements of paradise that are present. If you dwell only in your suffering, you will miss paradise. Don't ignore your suffering, but don't forget to enjoy the wonders of life, for your sake and for the benefit of many beings. Another key issue that a lot of Westerners have when they come into Buddhism, specifically those who are from a more atheistic or agnostic path, is the focus and description on suffering and transforming suffering can often bring about a sense of nihilism in a lot of people who do not have the rest of the framework to be able to process it. So yes, life is suffering. The purpose of Buddhism is to transform suffering, but to be held up on suffering constantly is a gridlock that will prevent you to maintain progress and will prevent you to live a healthy life. One of the key phrases, prescribed to Buddhism is the idea of the middle way. The middle way is not just about finding a balance, but it's understanding nuance between two juxtaposition points. Finding that balance between the two, but acknowledging how each function and how they behave within yourself. It's a process. It's not simple. And part of that process is what kind of makes me prefer something like a Buddhism to something like a Christianity. In a Christianity, it's so much about do this. The book says do this. With Buddhism, it is a series of guidelines in which you have to work towards that process yourself. It's a lot more about personal growth, introspection, than it is about devoting your time and effort towards another being. Thich Nhat Hanh continues, "When I was young, I wrote this poem. I penetrated the heart of the Buddha with a heart that was deeply wounded. My youth, an unripe plum, your teeth have left their marks on it. The tooth marks still vibrate. I remember always, remember always. Since I learned how to love you, the door of my soul has been left wide open, to the winds of the four directions. Reality calls for change. The fruit of awareness is already ripe, and the door can never be closed again. Fire consumes this century, and mountains and forests bear its mark. The wind howls across my ears, while the whole sky shakes vehemently in the snowstorm. Winter's wounds lie still, missing the frozen blade, restless, tossing and turning, in agony all night. He continues, I grew up in a time of war. There was destruction all around. Children, adults, values, a whole country. As a young person, I suffered a lot. Once the door of awareness has been opened, you cannot close it. The wounds of war in me are still not all healed. There are nights I lie awake and embrace my people, my country, and the whole planet with my mindful breathing. So, I feel like this poem is kind of an important, telling sign about Thich Nhat Hanh's past, to where he shows that change, that in his youth, he was aware of these things, he was aware of these principles, but was drowned in the situation, in the context of living during the Vietnam War. It shaped his perspective, and it seems like he fell closer towards that nihilism I spoke of before. Without suffering, you cannot grow. Without suffering, you cannot get the peace and the joy you deserve. Please don't run away from your suffering. Embrace it and cherish it. Go to the Buddha, sit with him, and show him your pain. He will look at you with loving kindness, compassion, and mindfulness, and show you ways to embrace your suffering and look deeply into it. With understanding and compassion, you will be able to heal the wounds in your heart and the wounds in the world. The Buddha called suffering a holy truth, because our suffering has the capacity of showing us the path to liberation. Embrace your suffering and let it reveal to you the way to peace. And so that concludes the first introductory section. And I believe I will probably conclude this first episode here and proceed immediately on to the next one. One last thing that I feel like is important to cover before moving on, especially to those who are very new to Buddhism, is Buddhism does not really have a Bible per se. There is no Quran, there is no Bible, there is no Torah. There's no consistent, coherent document by which you can just go to and that be the central means of you learning and understanding. There are a series of documents constructed and written over centuries. The most core basis for Buddhist texts is something called the Pali Canon. This was written relatively close after the Buddha's life. This is the core structural framework behind Buddhism, and then subsequent sutras or other documents were written by other monks or other figures in different branches of Buddhism, and they would give commentaries. And so in addition to these commentaries, the idea of the Dharma Talk is one of the most quintessential important pieces. It is a time in which the community comes together and hears somebody in, say, the clerical order, a monk, or some representative of the community, the Sangha. They will speak of the Dharma, explain things, but at the same time, this is meant to be an open discussion. So unlike with a lot of classic Christian preaching, there is meant to be a back and forth. There's meant to be discourse. The speaker is meant to be challenged, and they're expected to try to assist or alleviate the concerns or questions of the lay people. So with that in mind, I hope to receive some questions. I'm not a master at this. I'm relatively still a newcomer, but that discourse is fundamentally important for it to be a genuine Dharma talk. So if anybody likes this first episode and has questions, I intend to try to, come back and cover some of the questions from previous episodes as we proceed further along. And so that concludes the first one.